My name is JD, and this is my channel, Frost and Forest. So today, I am going to be doing a VR to Essence of the Moon. And so this VR is called Ancestral Roots Tag. So hashtag Ancestral Roots. This was a video that I saw that Essence of the Moon did, and it was a really great video. So I'll have it linked if you all want to check it out. But I was really inspired. I don't really have an ancestral work practice, but part of what attracted me to this tag is that there are a lot of decks that I have in my collection because they feel very connected to my family history, to the cultures I come from. They have that connection. And so that was part of the reason why I got excited about this tag, is because I wanted to share some of those decks that are special to me in that way. So I thought that that might be a fun way to do it. I have a very different cultural ancestry than Selena does. And so, I don't have that same connection to, Dia de los Muertos, but Halloween always does feel a particularly magical time of the year for me. And my family, at least one side of my family, pretty readily believe in ghosts. So, that's kind of where I am coming from on this topic. So yeah, I am just going to get started with the prompts and we will see how it goes. So the first prompt is a deck that connects you to your bloodline or family history. And so that is a little bit complicated in some ways because we are what you might call European mutts. They came from many different parts of Europe. And so, different decks that I use represent sort of different parts of that past for me. But the first one that I wanted to talk about, which was related to the first prompt, so a deck that connects you to your family history, the deck that I'm going to share is the Wild Whiskers Oracle. So this is a really great oracle deck. And the reason that I wanted to share that is because I do have sort of a family history coming from Eastern Europe. And so, or at least some of my family comes from there. And so this deck has always just reminded me of my grandmother's house for some reason. I don't fully know what it is, but it just has. And so that is why I wanted to share this one for this prompt. This is an oracle deck that I don't use a ton, but I could never really see myself getting rid of it just because of that sort of cultural connection to it, I guess. But it's a great little oracle deck. It has quite a few cards. It has the animal, it has the some keywords, it has a kind of a saying on the bottom, and then it's got a little teeny tiny guidebook that goes into a little bit more detail. But it does have some great cards, and it kind of reminds me of like a children's book. I love the chameleon card. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a children's book, but this one, just feels kind of culturally connected to me. It is kind of the same way, and I thought about showing this deck as well, but in the same way that the Slavic Legends deck also kind of has that feeling. But this one, just felt more like home. So I wanted to share that. So that is the first deck for the first prompt. The next deck is a deck that channels messages from ancestors or guides. This prompt, I had a little bit of trouble thinking about decks. Again, my practice is a little bit different, and so I didn't quite know how that prompt fit into my practice. But what I ended up deciding to do is, the deck that felt the most right to me is Dark Goddess Tarot. This is the mass market edition. And the reason that I thought that this one made the most sense is, you know, it is a goddess deck, so it has that sort of powerful feminine energy, which is what I tend to identify with the most. And it also just, this is a deck for a few years. I actually use this very, very consistently with my new moon practice. And so it does feel like a very, it seemed like the best deck to fall into this sort of guide category. This deck is really great. It has a lot of different goddesses. It has a different goddess for each of the cards, which I like. The goddesses are from all over the world. It is kind of an unruly deck a little bit. It's a little big and it's a little bit hard for me to shuffle. So that kind of gives you a sense of how much I actually like it, because I do still use it, even though it's big. And so, yeah, this deck just felt right. And that might be a theme for this video, is that I might not have necessarily a good reason why I picked some of these decks. They had the right feeling to me. And so this is the deck that I chose for the second prompt. So then the third prompt is a deck you use during Samhain, Day of the Dead, or Ancestral altars. And so for this one, I am going to share the Ghosts and Spirits Tarot. So the reason that I chose this deck for this prompt is on Halloween, I have a very specific tarot practice that I do every Halloween. It's really important to me to make time to do it. And I always use this deck for that practice. I'm not entirely sure why. I think it was maybe because this is one of my earliest decks that related to ghosts. And so it felt right. And then from there, it's just always been what I do. And so even though I don't use this deck a ton throughout the year, I would never move it along, because it is so important to that practice. And so this is a Lisa Hunt deck. I think it's one of my favorite of Lisa Hunt decks. And each card is related to a different ghost story. I love this Chariot card. It's one of my favorites. It's a portrayal of the hunt. And so I really like this deck, and it means a lot to me when I'm able to use it on Halloween. And so that's why I thought that this made sense for this prompt. And honestly, just pulling it out, I haven't looked at this deck. The chains, so the devil is Marley from A Christmas Carol, which I think is really cool. So, you know, some of them are like sort of historical figure ghosts, maybe. Some of them are more like myths and legends type ghosts. But I haven't pulled this deck out in quite a while. And so I am kind of excited to see it again after it's been most of the year. So yeah, this is definitely the deck that I use during Samhain, and I pull it out every Halloween night. Next deck is a deck that you use for healing generational trauma or cycles. And this was a kind of a tough one for me. One of the decks that came to mind first when I thought about this is the Crystal Visions Tarot. And so you might be looking at this deck and thinking that that is kind of a weird choice for this prompt. You know, this deck is been around for a long time. It is pretty light. It's not too serious of a deck. And it's very beautiful, obviously, as we can see. Very standard RWS. But the reason that I chose this deck for this prompt is because this is the kind of deck that teenage JD would have absolutely loved. It's very purpley. It's got a lot of strong women in it. It is got fairies and dragons, and it is definitely the kind of deck that high school me would have really, really liked. And honestly, it was around when I was in high school. So, you know, that makes a lot of sense. But the thing is that was a more difficult period in my life. And so the fact that it feels so connected to those years to me, and I've actually had other people in my family talk about how they think I would have loved this deck. And so it just, you know, because of that sort of perfect connection and that being a more difficult time in my life, I just, you know, I have a little bit of trouble with this deck. And while I have not actually done any work exactly in that way, I have considered that using this deck might be a good way to work on some of those things from my teenage years, because it does have that sort of representation piece. And this has kind of been a deck that I have it and I really like it and I like looking at it, but I very, very rarely use it for readings. And so, you know, I just, maybe someday when I'm ready to explore that more, this deck will have its time and place. Next prompt is a deck that helped you understand your soul lineage. And this is one of those things where I don't fully know why, but when I started thinking about this prompt, this is the deck that came to mind. And, you know, I tend to try to follow my intuition when a certain deck draws my attention to it. So maybe we'll explore it together a little bit as I go through the cards. But for this prompt, I chose the Wisdom of the Depths Tarot. This is a deck that I am really, really a big fan of. It is a collage deck, and it's very oceany and watery. It's sort of the first deck that I think of when I think of, like, I'm a Pisces, and so this feels like my Pisces deck about it. But I think a few different reasons why it sort of fits into this prompt as I'm looking at it is, one, because of the way it's done with collage, the images and the people are from a lot of different time periods in the past. So it maybe does have that more sort of ancestral feeling to it. I will also say that, you know, I come from many immigrants that came to the US in the 1800s. And so because of that, you know, many of them had to cross the ocean to get here. And so it does have that sort of historical ocean feeling to it. And I've always enjoyed being on the water, next to the water, next to the ocean, next to Lake Superior. You know, I don't get seasick, so I don't really know, but and like I said, I can't fully explain why this deck was the one that I chose for this, but it just made sense to me, and it just felt right. So this is the deck that I chose, the Wisdom of the Depths. The next deck is a deck you inherited or gifted or feel was meant for you. And so for me, I chose the Song of the Grandmothers. And this was a pretty easy one. And so the reason why I chose this one is I got this deck relatively early in my collecting. And I think it was one of my earlier indie decks I'm just curious what year this came out. I remember it being pretty early. Copyright 2022. Okay, so not the most earliest. It's maybe not as early as I remember it being. But anyway, that's not really part of the story. But anyway, I was on a Facebook group. It was like one of those trade groups. And this deck came up. And I reached out to the person who was selling it. And I was just said, you know, I'm really interested in this deck. You know, I'd love to get it. And the creator said, or the person who was rehoming it said, oh, great. And I would like to just send you this deck. And I was like, you know, what do you mean, send me the deck? And she was like, I would like to give you this deck. And I said, you know, can I at least pay for shipping on it? You know, are you sure? I'm a Midwesterner. It's, you know, not easy for us to accept things like that sometimes. And she says, yeah, I would like to just send you this deck. I just have a feeling that you're supposed to have this deck. And so it's like, okay, because, you know, I'm not going to turn down a gift from somebody who is being incredibly kind. And so it was great. And she sent this deck, and I've had this deck, and I would never get rid of this deck. But I think one of the great things about that experience, not only has it, you know, it meant that I got a deck that I wanted and a deck that I really, really love and I use a lot, but also I think it made me more, the best way I know how to describe it is that getting this deck made me feel goodwill towards people in this group. And so I tended to be more generous. I tend to be more generous these days in, you know, how much I'm asking for decks and what kind of trades I'm willing to do, and just, you know, trying to be a good community member, because it really made me feel good that she included me. And so it was definitely kind of feels like this sort of pay it forward thing for me, that I got this beautiful deck and I appreciate this beautiful deck. And so I try to take that energy and include it in when I am rehoming decks as well. So this, I think, was just a deck I was meant to have. So the next prompt is a deck that represents your cultural roots or ancestral land. So I actually have 2 decks that I'm going to share for this prompt, which my understanding is that's fine based on the original video. So the first one that I wanted to share is the Celtic Goddesses, Witches, and Queens Oracle. This is a really great oracle deck, and it shows Celtic, as the title says, Celtic goddesses, witches, and queens. But part of what I think is really great about this deck is that it is not just thinking about Celtic as Irish, which I think in many cases we think of Celtic as Irish or maybe Scottish or British Isles, but the period of the Celts was actually, you know, historically they covered many chunks of Europe as well, in France and in some, you know, Germanic areas as well. And so, and that a lot of my ancestry comes from those different areas. And so this deck just feels very ancestral lands to me, and it's part of what drew me to this deck, because there are goddesses, queens, and witches from not just Ireland and the British Isles, but other parts of Europe as well, and other parts of that sort of Celtic territory, which I think is really great. And so yeah, this just feels very ancestral to me. It also, the guidebook on this is really good. It talks about the being in the cards, as well as giving you sort of a divinatory meaning and then sort of like a prayer that you can go along with it. So the guidebook is very good and the art is very beautiful. And so this just feels very ancestral to me. The next deck that's in the same category that I wanted to share is a deck that is called Sacred Ireland Celtic Moon. So this is a deck that is from Ireland. It's created in Ireland, and it's a very good deck. It's a deck that I'm using right now for my full moon practice. But part of why it feels like that sort of sacred land is I can trace Irish ancestry on a couple of different sides of my family tree. And so this deck just feels very ancestral to me. And I think part of it is because some of the cards in this deck, like Bridget's Well, Sacred Site, talk about different locations, sacred locations in Ireland. And so, you know, it has that feeling to it. I had at one point had dreams of like not getting this deck until I actually am able to someday go to Ireland. But I also don't know when and if that is ever going to happen. So I decided not to wait on it, but instead decided to get it. But if I ever do make it to Ireland, I'm definitely bringing this deck along with me when I go. So yeah, this deck, it feels very ancestral to me. And it is one of those ways that I try to connect to my Irish heritage. So yeah, this is a great deck. So yeah, this is the second deck that I'm showing for a deck that represents your cultural or ancestral roots. The next prompt, and we only have a few more. The next prompt is a deck that has become a personal symbol of your lineage. So this is another one where I'm actually going to show two different decks for a couple of different reasons. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the Forager's Daughter Tarot. I would say that this is a deck that is a symbol of my personal lineage because basically this is the deck that I have found that feels the closest to nature that I am going to see where I am. You know, I'm in the Midwest, and this very much shows Midwestern flora and fauna that I could very clearly see. And so I think that part of why this connects with my personal lineage is because I personally have always had a big connection to nature. As a child, I was spending a lot of time out in the woods, and I have built my career around nature, and I come from farmers who work the land and had to be very connected to nature as well. And so just the fact that this is so focused on nature, as well as the specific nature that I find around me and that my family would have found around when they came to this country. And so, you know, this deck is this is one of my favorite decks, and it feels very spiritual to me, and it just, you know, a lot of my spiritual practice centers around nature and seasonality and cycles. And so this deck just fits that. And so it seemed to fit this prompt really well. Okay, and so then the next deck that I wanted to share with the same prompt of a symbol of a personal symbol of my lineage is the Womanhood Revisited Tarot. This is a deck that I personally really love. I only got it this year in March, but I really like it. And, you know, it's kind of surprising that I like it so much because, you know, the cardstock is not the best. The images have varying levels of pixelation, and, you know, it's just, and the pictures are from different time periods, and it's just kind of a hodgepodge. But even beyond all of that, I really, really like this deck. And it does feel like it fits into this category of personal symbol of lineage, because I come from a long line of strong women that fought for women's rights in different time periods and worked towards educating women and just in general, you know, that sort of feminist bent. And so because of this just feels like a deck that relates to my personal lineage, because I was raised by a lot of strong women who believed in women's rights and believed that women can do anything men can do, and, you know, just taught me to live my life that way. And so because of that, this deck just feels kind of important to me. So yeah, this is the other one that is for a symbol of my personal lineage. So this is the last prompt where I'm going to show a deck. So this prompt is a deck that calls in wisdom of grandmothers or elders. And so for me, I picked the, it's in this bag, but it's the Wisdom of the Cailleach. This is so a deck from Ireland. Ooh, it's really big. We'll see how this goes. And it focuses on the Cailleach, and it's a very beautiful deck. But part of why I love it is because of all of this grandmother wisdom feeling that comes from this deck. We have so there are some cards that are like this one. So they are very much sort of a portrait almost. And these are considered part of the wise women's circle. The circle of old women is what it says. And so there are, I think it's maybe 6 cards that show this sort of portrait, and that sort of different, I don't want to say incarnations, but different parts of the Cailleach and what she represents. And so because of that, it does have a very much a grandmother energy. And then the other cards are more like oracle cards that show, you know, the Irish countryside. But here's another one from the Circle of Wise Women. Yeah, and there's another one. And then I pulled out the last one as well. And so, you know, I have definitely done spreads where I pull out this, just the Circle of Wise Women, and use that to sort of tap into that ancestral ancestral history there. And so this is a deck that I kind of use. I mean, I will use it in the summertime sometime, but for the most part, I use this deck sort of starting at Samhain and then kind of going until, I think is it Ostara? I'm blanking on it right now, but I tend to use this deck until either Ostara or Imbolc, when sort of, that is the time when it was historically believed that the Cailleach was walking the earth. And so, you know, this deck just feels very ancestral to me, and it very much feels like it incorporates that grandmother energy. And it's just a beautiful deck. So that is the last deck that I'm going to share. So the last prompt for this tag is, what does ancestral work mean to you, and how do your cards support it? And I will actually say, you know, this VR came out, I think like a month ago, and I actually had a lot of trouble doing this. I was really excited to do it, and I really wanted to share this, but I was just feeling kind of blocked. The reason for that is because the way Ancestral works from the way that I think about Ancestral work is very different than the way Selena does, which no judgment on that. I really admire her practice, and I have loved watching her channel and getting to hear about the different ways that she thinks about it. I think that that's really great, and it's really gotten me excited and really gotten me to want to learn more. But up until this point, really what that's meant for me is ancestral work is more about, instead of like what other people are trying to do of like communicating with ancestors, for me it's more about pulling in that ancestral energy or heritage. Heritage feels like a good word to me, of pulling that in when I'm pulling cards. It's a little bit different. And so while this tag felt really fun and interesting, it did feel like I come at it from sort of a different direction. And so hopefully that all makes sense. I don't know, maybe I'm just rambling, who knows? But it's been really fun to think about this, and I want to thank Selena for coming up with this awesome tag and really getting me thinking. I think that this is one of the tags that I spent the most time thinking about and preparing for out of any video I've made. So that just tells you that this really sparked my attention, which I think is great. And I really appreciate that. And so thank you so much for joining me for this VR. I hope you found it interesting. I would love to hear more about your ancestral work and some of the ways that you come at it. So if you decide to do a VR, definitely let me know. I'd be very excited to hear. I will also say, if you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you could hit the like button, as well as if you think you're interested in this content. I post a video a week, mostly focusing on tarot, doing VRs like this one, or talking about the decks that I'm using, sometimes new decks, just kind of whatever I'm thinking about related to tarot. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, you might want to think about hitting the subscribe button, which also helps me out as well as I continue to try to grow as a channel. But yeah, thank you so much for stopping by.